The weight of silence. The silence in George's house was deafening. At 72, he had imagined his golden years filled with warmth, laughter, and the comforting hum of a life well lived. Instead, he sat alone in his small home, staring out the window as the golden hues of the setting sun bathed the world in light. Everything except the emptiness he felt inside. 3 years had passed since Margaret, his beloved wife, was taken from him, leaving behind an echoing void. His children, grown and wrapped up in their own busy lives, called occasionally, but the conversations were brief, filled with rushed assurances of love before the line went dead. The house, once brimming with noise, now stood in solemn silence, a quiet George never asked for, but couldn't escape. Desperate for distraction, he drowned himself in television, scrolled endlessly through social media, and even joined a local, senior group. But nothing truly filled the void. The company of others was fleeting, and each time he returned home, the stillness embraced him once again, like an old, unwanted friend. One evening, in a moment of restless channel flipping, he stumbled upon a documentary about Buddhist monks. They lived in solitude not with sorrow, but with serenity. They spoke of silence as a companion, not a curse. Their words lingered, stirring something within him. Could solitude be more than an empty space? Could it be an invitation? A journey? He didn't know, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar. Curiosity. The next morning, instead of sinking into the usual routine of noise, George did something different. He stepped outside. The crisp morning air wrapped around him as he walked aimlessly through the quiet streets. Birds sang in the distance, their melodies cutting through the stillness. As he turned a corner, he noticed a small group sitting in the park, their eyes closed, their breath steady. A sign nearby read, "Community meditation, all are welcome." He stood there for a long moment, watching, debating. Meditation? That wasn't for him, was it? And yet, the peace on their faces lingered in his mind long after he had walked away. That night, as he lay in bed, he found himself unable to shake the thought. Maybe, just maybe, solitude wasn't something to escape. Maybe it was something to embrace. And so, George's quiet journey began. If you've ever felt the weight of silence like George, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's explore this journey together. And if you'd like to follow along as George discovers the beauty of solitude, consider subscribing for more inspiring stories. Chapter 1. Wrestling with Loneliness. George's first attempt at embracing solitude did not go as smoothly as he had hoped. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, determined to start his day with a quiet mind. But silence, it seemed, had its own voice. The ticking of the clock grew louder, the hum of the refrigerator an unrelenting drone. His thoughts began to spiral. Memories of Margaret, regrets from the past, and an overwhelming sense of loneliness pressed in on him. He had thought solitude would be peaceful, but in that moment, it felt like a confrontation with everything he had been trying to avoid. Desperate for a distraction, George reached for his phone, his fingers instinctively opening social media. The endless stream of pictures and updates from others' seemingly full lives only deepened his isolation. He put the phone down with a sigh. This wasn't working. He decided to take another walk, hoping movement would clear his mind. As he wandered the quiet streets, he found himself drawn back to the park where the meditation group had gathered the day before. They were there again, sitting in stillness, unbothered by the world around them. How could they sit so comfortably, in silence while he felt suffocated by it? Summoning his courage, George approached an older man who had just finished the session. "Excuse me." He hesitated. "How do you do it? How do you sit in silence without feeling alone?" The man, introducing himself as Thomas, smiled warmly. "The silence isn't the problem," he said. "It's what you bring into it. You have to learn to sit with yourself, not against yourself." The words stayed with George long after their conversation ended. That night, he sat in his armchair, turning over Thomas's words in his mind. He had always seen silence as an absence of sound, of company, of purpose. But what if it was something more? The next morning, he tried something new. Instead of reaching for the remote, he sat with his coffee and simply listened. He heard the birds outside, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car engine. He focused on his breath, slow and steady. It wasn't easy. His mind raced, thoughts pulling him back to memories of Margaret, to old regrets, to worries about the future. But he didn't fight them this time. He simply observed them, letting them drift by like clouds in the sky. Day by day he practiced. The loneliness didn't disappear overnight, but something shifted. The silence began to feel less like an enemy, and more like a quiet companion. He journaled his thoughts, scribbling down what came to mind, no matter how trivial. Some days, he wrote about Margaret, about how much he missed her. Other days, he wrote about the feeling of the sun on his skin during his morning walks. Slowly, he started to see beauty in the little things. One afternoon, he returned to the park, this time not just to observe but to join. He sat with the meditation group, feeling awkward at first, but soon, he found himself breathing in rhythm with them. When he opened his eyes, Thomas smiled knowingly. "Better?" Thomas asked. George nodded. It wasn't perfect, and he still had much to learn. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something new. Peace. In the weeks that followed, George deepened his practice. He began each day with quiet reflection instead of distractions. He learned to cook meals for himself and enjoy them, without the crutch of background noise. He explored new hobbies, gardening, painting, and reading books he had never made time for before. Occasionally, the loneliness would creep back in. But now, he had tools to face it. When the ache of missing Margaret felt overwhelming, he would sit with it rather than run from it. He allowed himself to grieve, but he also allowed himself to heal. One evening, as George stood by his window, watching the sunset cast warm hues across the sky, he realized something profound. The silence had not changed, but he had. It was no longer something to endure. It was something to embrace. Perhaps solitude wasn't a void to be filled. Perhaps it was a space to grow. Chapter 2. Embracing the stillness. George woke up the next morning feeling lighter. The familiar weight of loneliness was still there, but it no longer pressed down so heavily. He had begun to see his solitude as something to explore rather than, soon, escape. Instead of reaching for his phone or turning on the television, he took his coffee out to the porch. The air was crisp, the world still half asleep. He listened, not just to the birds, but to the rhythm of his own breath, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. For the first time, the stillness felt alive. He spent the next few days deepening his meditation practice, experimenting with longer periods of silence. At first, his mind resisted. Thoughts of unfinished projects, old regrets, and future uncertainties would surface. But each time, he reminded himself of Thomas's words, "Sit with yourself, not against yourself." One afternoon, George decided to visit a nearby nature reserve. The place was vast, filled with winding trails and quiet ponds. He found a secluded bench by the water and sat down, taking in the reflection of the sky on the rippling surface. There, in the embrace of nature, he let go. He allowed himself to simply exist, without the need to do or achieve anything. A gentle peace settled over him. He realized that solitude had never been the problem. It was his resistance to it that had made it so painful. Now, he was learning to surrender, to trust in the quiet moments. Back at home, he started incorporating small rituals into his days. He drank his tea mindfully, savoring the warmth. He wrote letters to Margaret, not to send, but to express what was in his heart. He even started cooking again, finding joy in preparing meals for himself rather than seeing it as a chore. One day, he decided to visit a local bookstore. Wandering through the aisles, he found himself drawn to a section on mindfulness and spirituality. He picked up a book on Zen teachings and flipped through its pages, intrigued by the simplicity and wisdom of the words. He bought the book and spent the afternoon reading, underlining passages that resonated with him. As days turned into weeks, George felt himself transforming. He began practicing gratitude, writing down 3 things he was thankful for each morning. Some days it was as simple as the warmth of the sun on his face, the taste of freshly brewed coffee, or the kindness of a stranger who held the door open for him. These small acknowledgments filled his heart with a quiet joy. His walks in the park became longer, and he took time to observe the details he once overlooked. The way the leaves swayed in the wind, the shifting colors of the sky, the gentle ripples on the surface of the pond. The world had not changed, but his way of seeing it had. One evening, George found himself sitting on his porch, watching the sky darken as stars began to emerge. He thought about how much had shifted in such a short time. The silence that once felt unbearable now felt like a friend. He was no longer trying to fill the space with noise or distractions. He was simply being, and that was enough. For the first time in years, George no longer felt lost. He was exactly where he needed to be. Chapter 3. Learning and Transformation. As the days turned into weeks, George's solitude was no longer a burden, but a space of discovery. With each morning spent in quiet contemplation, he began to unravel layers of himself he had long ignored. There was an undeniable shift in his perspective. Where once he sought distractions, now he sought understanding. Determined to deepen his practice, George returned to the park meditation group. This time, he was not just an observer, but an eager participant. He listened attentively as Thomas spoke about mindfulness and the art of being present. Most of us spend our lives either dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. Thomas explained. True peace is found in the now. The words resonated deeply with George. He had spent years replaying old regrets and anxieties, never truly allowing himself to be in the moment. That evening, he sat in his armchair, closed his eyes, and tried to focus solely on his breath. The practice was difficult at first. His mind, conditioned to wander, resisted the stillness. But he remained patient, reminding himself that growth was not about perfection, but persistence. One afternoon, George came across an old wooden box tucked away in his closet. Inside, he found handwritten letters from Margaret, filled with memories, laughter, and words of love. At first, the sight of them brought a familiar ache. But instead of pushing the emotions away, he embraced them. He read each letter slowly, letting himself feel the sadness and the gratitude intertwined. For the first time, he allowed himself to grieve fully, not as something to suppress, but as a part of his journey. Inspired by this experience, George began writing letters of his own. Letters not just to Margaret, but to himself. He wrote about his struggles, his fears, and his hopes. The act of putting thoughts to paper became a powerful form of self-reflection, helping him understand himself on a deeper level. His days were now filled with purpose. He expanded his reading beyond mindfulness and delved into philosophy, psychology, and the teachings of great thinkers. He found solace in the idea that suffering was universal, but so was resilience. He started journaling his reflections, capturing moments of clarity and insight. With each entry, he saw himself evolving, not just as a man learning to live alone, but as a man learning to live fully. He also began to practice gratitude. Each morning, before even getting out of bed, he would think of 3 things he was thankful for. Some days, it was something as simple as the warmth of his blanket or the first sip of coffee. Other days, it was the kindness of a stranger, the beauty of a sunset, or a memory that made him smile. This small practice changed his outlook, shifting his focus from what he had lost to what he still had. One morning, during a meditation session at the park, Thomas approached him with a smile. "You seem different, George," he said. "Lighter." George nodded, realizing the truth in those words. He was lighter. Not because the weight of loneliness had disappeared, but because he had learned to carry it differently. His transformation was not about erasing the past, but about embracing it. He had found a way to coexist with his solitude, turning it into a source of strength rather than sorrow. And in doing so, he discovered something profound. He was never truly alone, for within him lay an entire world waiting to be explored. One evening, as George walked home from the park, he reflected on how far he had come. The loneliness that once felt suffocating had softened into a quiet companion. The silence that once felt empty was now filled with meaning. He no longer feared being alone. He welcomed it, knowing that within stillness, he could hear his own heart. For the first time in his life, George was not searching for something outside himself. He had everything he needed within. And with each passing day, he continued to grow, not despite his solitude, but because of it. Chapter 4. Sharing the Wisdom. As George continued to embrace his solitude, he began to notice something unexpected. His perspective was shifting, not just for himself, but in the way he saw others. He realized that loneliness was not unique to him. It was something that many around him carried, often in silence. One afternoon, as he sat in the park journaling, he noticed a man sitting alone on a nearby bench. The man, who appeared to be in his late 50s, looked lost in thought, his gaze distant and his shoulders slumped. George recognized that look all too well, the weight of solitude before one learns to make peace with it. Summoning his courage, George stood up and approached the man. "Mind if I sit?" he asked gently. The man looked up, startled for a moment, then nodded. "Sure." For a while, they sat in silence, watching the ducks glide across the pond. Finally, George spoke. "You look like a man with a lot on his mind." The man sighed, rubbing his hands together. "It's been a rough year. My wife passed away last winter. My kids live out of state. And suddenly, it's just me. I thought I'd get used to it, but I don't know. The house feels too quiet." George nodded, understanding every word. "I've been there," he admitted. "When my wife passed, I felt like I was walking through an empty world. I kept trying to fill the silence with distractions, but nothing seemed to help." The man turned to look at George. "So, how did you get through it?" George smiled gently. "I stopped trying to run from it. Instead, I learned to sit with it. At first, it was hard, painful even, but then I realized something. Solitude isn't the enemy. It's a space where we can listen to ourselves, heal, and grow." The man was quiet for a moment, then let out a small chuckle. "I never thought of it that way." Over the next hour, George shared his journey. The meditation, the journaling, the small moments of gratitude that had slowly transformed his loneliness into something more meaningful. The man, whose name was Robert, listened intently, nodding occasionally, sometimes asking questions. By the time the sun began to set, there was a new lightness in Robert's posture. "Would you come back here tomorrow?" Robert asked hesitantly. "I think I'd like to try this whole sitting with myself thing, but I wouldn't mind a little guidance." George smiled. "Of course. We can sit together." And so, George's journey took on a new purpose. He was no longer just learning for himself. He was sharing his wisdom, helping others walk the same path he had once struggled through. He realized that peace was not something to keep to oneself. It was something to give, to share, and to nurture in others. As he walked home that evening, he felt something different. A sense of connection, not just with Robert, but with the world. He had spent so long fearing loneliness, only to discover that in embracing it, he had opened himself up to something far greater. The quiet, unspoken bond between those who truly understand what it means to be alone and to find peace within it. Chapter 5. A New Purpose. The next morning, George found himself walking toward the park with a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent so much time searching for meaning in solitude that he had never considered that his journey could help someone else. As he approached the bench where he had met Robert the day before, he felt a quiet sense of anticipation. Robert was already there, sitting with his hands folded in his lap, gazing out at the pond. He looked up as George arrived and gave a small, grateful smile. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back." George chuckled. "I said I would, didn't I?" He settled onto the bench beside Robert, taking in the peaceful morning air. After a few moments of silence, he asked, "How are you feeling today?" Robert exhaled slowly. "Still lonely, but not as lost as yesterday." George nodded. "That's a start. Solitude isn't about avoiding loneliness. It's about learning how to be at peace with it." They sat in quiet companionship for a while, allowing the stillness to settle around them. Then George spoke again. "Would you like to try something? Just a simple exercise." Robert hesitated, then nodded. "Sure. Close your eyes," George instructed. "Take a deep breath in and out. Now, just listen to the wind, the birds, the water. Don't force your thoughts away. Just let them pass, like clouds in the sky." Robert did as instructed, his shoulders gradually relaxing. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, focusing on the present moment. When Robert opened his eyes, there was a newfound calmness in his expression. "That was different," he admitted. "Not as hard as I thought." George smiled. "It gets easier. The more you practice, the more you realize that silence isn't empty. It's full of everything we've been too distracted to notice." Over the next few weeks, George and Robert met regularly. They meditated together, shared stories, and slowly built a quiet friendship rooted in understanding. Robert started keeping a journal, writing down thoughts and feelings he had suppressed for years. He found solace in the process, just as George had. One afternoon, as they sat under the shade of a large oak tree, Robert turned to George. "You know, you've helped me more than I can put into words. I don't think I would have gotten through this alone." George shook his head. "You were never alone, Robert. You just needed to see it differently." For the first time in a long while, Robert smiled. A genuine, heartfelt smile. "I think I'm starting to understand." As George walked home that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fulfillment. He had spent so long searching for meaning in solitude, only to realize that it was never about finding something for himself. It was about sharing what he had learned with others. He now understood that solitude wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning of something greater. Embracing the journey. As the seasons changed, so did George. The solitude that had once felt like a heavy burden now felt like a trusted companion. His days were no longer filled with longing for the past or anxiety about the future. Instead, he lived each moment fully, appreciating the beauty and the quiet simplicity of life. One crisp autumn morning, George sat on his porch, a warm cup of tea in hand. The golden leaves swayed gently in the breeze, and he smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. He had spent so much of his life searching for meaning, only to realize that it had always been within him. Solitude had not taken anything from him. It had given him the space to heal, to grow, and to truly know himself. He thought of Robert and the many conversations they had shared. Helping someone else navigate their own loneliness had been an unexpected gift, one that had deepened George's understanding of his own journey. He had learned that peace wasn't something to be found outside. It was something cultivated within. With each passing day, George felt lighter. He continued his meditations, his journaling, and his walks through the park, But more than anything, he simply allowed himself to be, to exist without the need to chase, to fix, or to prove anything. And in that surrender, he found true freedom. As the sun dipped below the horizon, George closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He was exactly where he needed to be. Alone, yet never lonely. At peace, at last. If George's journey resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's create a community where we support one another in finding peace and fulfillment. Your insights could inspire someone on their own path to self-discovery. For more reflections on solitude, mindfulness, and inner peace, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing meaningful stories and life lessons. Don't forget to like this video and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Together, we can embrace the beauty of solitude and the strength it brings.